The day Cassandra had been waiting for had finally arrived. A full year had passed since Itan had proposed to her in the same restaurant that, for her, felt like a sanctuary of memories. It was there that candles flickered gently on the table, wine warmed hearts, and promises of love were exchanged for the first time. Cassandra believed that repeating that scenario would not only be a celebration, but a way to reaffirm the strength of a bond that, despite the challenges, seemed resilient. She had spent weeks carefully choosing her dress, imagining his smile when he saw her, mentally projecting the flavor of the favorite dish they shared that night. For her, everything had to be perfect, as if that dinner were not just a date on the calendar, but the confirmation that the love she had chosen was worth it. In her heart, the restaurant was the stage where the past would meet the present to project the future. Cassandra's heart raced with each step of preparation. She had reserved the table in advance, insisting on sitting in the same spot where Itan, a year earlier, had held her trembling hands and declared her the best thing that had ever happened to him. That phrase echoed in her mind like an old song, full of hope and tenderness. As she applied her makeup in front of the mirror, she remembered the insecurity she had felt on that inaugural night and the comfort she found in his gaze. Now, a year later, she believed she was stronger, more mature, ready to embark on new chapters. Every detail of the gathering had been meticulously thought out. The perfume she had chosen, the flowers she had discreetly placed on the table, even the soft playlist playing quietly in the back of the room. Cassandra was convinced Itan would notice this effort, and secretly, she hoped he, too, was eager to relive that magical moment. As she walked toward the restaurant, Cassandra felt like a character in a movie, crossing the brightly lit streets of Seattle with her heart full of anticipation. The cold night seemed complicit in her enthusiasm, and every light reflected in the shop windows seemed to twinkle in tune with her hope. She remembered how Itan had surprised her at the beginning of their relationship, a self-assured, elegant man who seemed to carry the world in his hands. And she, in contrast, had always seen herself as someone simple, almost outside the norm that his social circle demanded. Still, he had chosen to be by her side, and that thought warmed her heart. For Cassandra, that dinner would be proof that their love had overcome their differences, that her decision to invest time and energy in their relationship had not been in vain. It was more than a celebration, it was a confirmation. The restaurant was full, but Cassandra only had eyes for the table she'd chosen so carefully. The candles were already lit, the flowers discreetly arranged, and the intimate atmosphere contrasted with the buzz of other conversations around her. She arrived a few minutes before Itan, as usual, because she enjoyed the feeling of anticipation, of waiting anxiously for him to enter. Sitting there, she remembered the moment he'd first appeared at that very door, carrying an impromptu bouquet that had elicited a nervous laugh from her. A year had passed, but deep down, Cassandra wanted to believe that the same man, romantic and attentive, still existed behind the increasingly busy and distant facade he wore. In that moment, as she watched the glass reflecting the lights in the room, she believed with all her heart that their reunion that night would rekindle what had seemed to be fading. Deep down, Cassandra felt that dinner wasn't just a celebratory ritual, but a turning point. Much was at stake: her trust, her hope, her faith in the future she had so envisioned with Itan. Because of this, she held a secret in her heart that she hadn't yet revealed to him, something that would make that night an even more special milestone. The truth is that over the past few months, she had been silently striving for something he could never have imagined, and that night would come to a surprising surface. But before revealing her hidden gift, Cassandra simply wanted to live in the moment. She wanted to look into his eyes and feel that every sacrifice, every silence, every secretly swallowed tear had been worth it. In that restaurant, she wasn't just a young woman in love. She was a woman willing to fight for her story, to believe that there was still poetry even in the most turbulent relationships. She didn't want it to be just another night. As she adjusted her napkin on her lap and took a deep breath, Cassandra knew she was hiding something that could make that date an unforgettable one. For 6 months, she lived a secret routine that not even her closest friends knew about. While Itan slept, while the world rested, she locked herself in her room with books, audiobooks, and scribbled notebooks. Her greatest desire was to surprise him with something beyond material gifts. She wanted to prove that her love wasn't limited to loose words or superficial gestures, but that it was capable of crossing cultural and emotional barriers. At that moment, with every heartbeat, she remembered the sleepless nights, the frustration faced with difficult words, and the immense satisfaction of finally understanding entire sentences. Also that, at their one-year anniversary dinner, she could look into Itan's eyes and express herself in Spanish. Spanish was more than a foreign language to Cassandra. It was the language of his roots, the culture that shaped his family, the language that echoed in gatherings she couldn't follow. How many times had she felt invisible, unable to understand quick jokes or whispered comments around the table? How many times had she felt the weight of being on the sidelines, simply smiling and pretending not to notice? It was this feeling that drove her to overcome herself. The gift she prepared for Itan was at once a gesture of love and a silent cry of belonging. She wanted to tell him in his own language, "I chose you. I chose your life, your heritage, your way of seeing the world." Each conjugation she learned was more than study. It was the embodiment of her dedication. There were times when Cassandra almost gave up. The jumbled letters, the different sounds, the expressions that didn't make sense. Everything seemed to conspire against her. But in every moment of weakness, the image of Itan's face motivated her to continue. She imagined the look on his face when he realized that the woman he presented as simple or non-standard was willing to cross emotional oceans to be by his side. It wasn't just learning to speak, but learning to walk closer to the one he claimed to love. In her hidden notebooks, rehearsed phrases were written like promises, declarations of love, small thanks, and even a few jokes that would sound natural to a couple in love. For her, it was the sweetest secret she had ever kept, and also the riskiest, because it carried the expectation of profound recognition. When she imagined revealing her surprise, Cassandra visualized the moment in slow motion. They were at the table, she was holding his hand, looking into his eyes and uttering the words she'd practiced so much. She saw his smile widen, first in surprise, then in emotion, and finally, in pride. She fantasized about the tight embrace, the passionate kiss, and even a tear sliding down his face. It was this scene that kept her going, that made every night of studying worthwhile. After all, love for her wasn't just about expensive gifts or exotic trips, but about gestures that demonstrated dedication. Her secret was a gift of the soul, something he could never buy, something born of vulnerability and the courage to surrender. As she waited for Itan that night, Cassandra kept her secret hidden like a rare jewel in her heart. She knew she couldn't reveal everything at once. She wanted the moment to be perfect, the timing impeccable, every word in Spanish to sound natural and loving. It was like preparing a show whose audience was only one person, but the most important of all. What she didn't yet know was that this gift, so carefully planned, would become a turning point in her life. Because while it would make her stronger and more aware of her worth, it would also reveal the darkest side of the one she thought she loved. The surprise she was preparing was, unbeknownst to her, the key to a shock that would change everything from then on. The memory of the beginning of their relationship flashed through her mind like an old movie, full of details only her heart could hold. Cassandra remembered the day she met Itan on a rainy afternoon in Seattle, when the rush of the city forced her to take shelter under the same awning as he. There was something magnetic about that chance encounter. His smile, confident and warm, contrasted with the biting cold of the rain that ran down the streets. He offered her his umbrella without a second thought, a simple gesture that became a symbol of care. It was in that instant that a silent connection was established, as if fate had arranged a perfect coincidence. Cassandra, accustomed to going unnoticed, felt seen in a different way, and this feeling was so powerful that she let herself go, believing the universe was finally rewarding her for all the solitude she had experienced. Itan's charm wasn't just his impeccable appearance or his accent, which carried nuances of his heritage. He had a unique way of speaking that made Cassandra believe every word. During their first encounters, he always seemed attentive, interested in listening to her stories, laughing at her insecurities and praising her dreams, no matter how simple. For her, this was almost unbelievable. A man like him, so different from her world, seemed to see something precious in her. With each impromptu dinner, each walk hand in hand under the city lights, Cassandra was convinced she had found the kind of love movies promise, the kind that transforms even the grayest days into something special. The beginning was enchanting, a spell that made her believe Itan would be the protagonist of her life story. There was a constant duality in Cassandra's heart. On one hand, the overwhelming thrill of being beside someone who seemed to belong to an unattainable world. On the other, the silent fear of not living up to Itan's expectations. She remembered how out of place she felt when she walked into the fancy restaurants he chose, or when she saw him surrounded by influential friends. But in the first few months, this contrast didn't bother her so much because Itan always had a way of softening the weight of their differences. A look, a joke, an unexpected gesture, and she felt like she belonged again. It was as if the beginning of their relationship was made of sweet illusions, covering the cracks that would later become chasms. Every gesture he made during those first months was treasured in Cassandra's heart. The way Itan held her hand as they crossed the street, the unexpected messages that popped up throughout the day, even the way he seemed proud to introduce her to his friends as his girlfriend. All of this made her believe she had found not just a companion, but a safe haven. There were nights when she found herself smiling to herself, remembering trivial details, like the funny way he pronounced certain words in English. These small fragments of memory formed the foundation of the trust she placed in the relationship. Cassandra believed that with Itan she could build a life where love would be enough to overcome any barrier. However, looking back on that anniversary night, Cassandra could already see the seeds of darkness planted from the beginning. Itan had always been overconfident, certain that his presence was enough to win her over. The same kindness that had seduced her also carried traces of disguised control, of an ego that needed constant feeding. Blinded by passion, she failed to notice the signs of arrogance hidden behind his charming smile. What seemed like care was often simply his need for superiority, but in that beginning, everything was too sweet to question. Cassandra only saw the rain ceasing, his outstretched hand, and the silent invitation to dive into a story that seemed to promise eternal love. From the beginning, Cassandra realized that her relationship with Itan wasn't about balance, but about contrasts. While he walked with self-assuredness, possessed of an almost arrogant self-confidence, she constantly felt out of place, as if she were an intruder in a world that didn't belong to her. He frequented social circles filled with sophisticated, well-traveled people who discussed investments and contemporary art. Cassandra, on the other hand, coming from a simple family, felt like she was always one step behind. At meetings, she would remain silent, observing, laughing shyly when she didn't understand the jokes filled with references that escaped her world. Still, she tried to convince herself that love would be enough to bridge the chasm that separated them. After all, Itan had chosen her, and that in itself felt like a victory over all her insecurities. These differences began to weigh more heavily as time passed. Itan seemed to feed off the admiration of others, and Cassandra, almost without realizing it, became a spectator to a spectacle he performed daily. His confidence was evident in every word, every gesture, while she withdrew, trying to adapt to situations without attracting attention. Deep down, she wished he would recognize her insecurities, to embrace her, but Itan rarely showed the sensitivity. On the contrary, he reveled in his position of prominence, while she carried the burden of feeling inadequate alone. Still, Cassandra persisted, believing that love meant learning to fit in, even when the space seemed too small for her essence. There were nights when Cassandra would come home exhausted, not from the time she'd spent with Itan, but from the effort of adapting to an environment that wasn't natural to her. She would mentally relive conversations, try to remember terms she didn't understand, rehearse new lines in front of the mirror, as if life with him were an endless rehearsal for a play she'd never master. Itan, on the other hand, seemed indifferent to her efforts. To him, it was almost natural for Cassandra to bow to his implicit demands. After all, in his eyes, she should feel privileged to be with someone like him, and it was precisely this thought that made her doubt herself, fueling the insecurity that shadowed her. But there was also a part of Cassandra that silently grew stronger. Every discomfort, every sideways glance, every joke that excluded her, awakened in her a desire to go beyond being a supporting character. Even without realizing it, she began to silently plan ways to show that she too had value, that she wasn't just the simple girlfriend. The secret to learning Spanish stemmed from this very feeling, the desire to prove, to herself and to Itan, that she could overcome the barriers he, consciously or unconsciously, placed between them. She didn't want to simply shadow him. She wanted to walk beside him. It was her silent response to his arrogance and her fear of not being enough. At that anniversary dinner, all these differences seemed to hover over the table like invisible ghosts. Cassandra was no longer the same young woman who silently accepted discomfort. She had matured in the silence of her struggles, even if Itan hadn't realized it. What for him remained a game of power and status for her had become a field of resistance and self-discovery. The differences in worlds, which had previously suffocated her, now served as fuel for her to prepare for something greater. It was as if every detail of their relationship had drawn a map that would lead her to an inevitable revelation. Cassandra could already sense that night would not end the same way it began. The first meeting with Ethan's mother was etched in Cassandra's memory as a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. He had warned her that his mother was a demanding woman, proud of her roots and extremely protective of her son. When she arrived at the family home, she was greeted by a sharp gaze that seemed to analyze her every detail, from her simple clothing to her shy way of speaking. The woman spoke Spanish naturally, without bothering to translate, leaving Cassandra on the sidelines of the conversation. Although she had a polite smile on her face, there was an invisible distance, a silent judgment that made her feel like an intruder on sacred territory. At that moment, Cassandra understood that, to be truly accepted, she would need to connect not only with Ethan, but also with her cultural origins. During that dinner, Cassandra could barely follow what was happening. Between the quick laughs and comments in Spanish exchanged between mother and son, she felt like a shadow sitting at the table. There were moments when Ethan didn't even notice her silence, immersed in childhood memories and stories that only the two of them shared. Cassandra smiled without understanding, shook her head, but inside, her heart sank. It was in this discomfort that the decision that would change the course of her life was born, to learn the language that united them. More than a language, it was a bridge to Ethan's heart, and perhaps to earn the respect of this woman who regarded her with reservations. She didn't want to be just the girlfriend he brought along for show, but someone capable of immersing herself in his world. That night was difficult, but also revealing. When she got home, Cassandra felt small, almost invisible. She wondered if she was truly worthy of being by his side, if she wasn't just forcing her way into a world that would never accept her. Yet, along with the pain, a flame of determination grew. Silently, she swore to herself that she would learn Spanish. Not to conform to her mother-in-law's tastes, but to show herself that she could be more, that she could carve out a place for herself in any situation. It was a gesture of love, but also of self-challenge. She began the next day, downloading apps, buying books, writing down each new word as if they were pieces of a puzzle she needed to put together. There were times when Cassandra imagined herself standing before her mother-in-law again, this time participating firmly in the conversation, smiling not mechanically, but genuinely, understanding and responding. She fantasized about Ethan's mother's surprised look, perhaps even a comment of approval. This thought sustained her through nights of solitary study, when sleep seemed an enemy and words jumbled in her tired mind. Each verb learned felt like a personal victory, proof that she would not give up easily. If at first the goal was simply to get closer to Ethan and his family, over time the process became much deeper. Cassandra discovered within herself a strength she had never imagined. Deep down, what hurt Cassandra most wasn't the cultural distance, but the lack of recognition. Ethan had never realized how much that dinner had impacted her self-esteem, nor how her mother's critical gaze had wounded her. But Cassandra didn't complain, didn't argue. She turned that wound into fuel. Ethan's mother never imagined that her distant behavior was triggering a radical change in the young woman's life. That birthday night, sitting back in the restaurant, Cassandra carried this untold story in her heart, that of a woman who out of love and dignity decided to reinvent herself. And little did she know that this silent effort would be the key to unmasking who Ethan truly was. What Cassandra expected to be an intimate dinner, full of meaning and memories, began to crumble as soon as she entered the restaurant. Instead of the discreet, carefully reserved table for two, she found a lively group of Ethan's friends already seated, filling the space with loud laughter and raising wine glasses toasting. For a moment, she thought she'd mistaken the date or location, but his carefree gaze as he waved from afar confirmed the reality. The evening that should have been just theirs had turned into yet another social showcase for Ethan. Cassandra's heart sank. She had held flowers in her eyes, hopes in her hands, and a secret on her lips. But now everything seemed out of place, like a piece that didn't fit in the noisy puzzle of the crowded table. She sat beside him, trying to hide her discomfort. She expected at the very least an explanation or a gesture that would show Ethan hadn't forgotten the significance of the date. But he, busy introducing friends, talking business, and laughing out loud at his own jokes, barely paid her any attention. Cassandra, silent, held the weight of disappointment. It wasn't just the frustration of not having the dinner of her dreams, but the bitter feeling of realizing her dedication seemed invisible. The carefully chosen dress, the secret she'd kept, the expectation of an intimate reunion, everything now seemed ridiculous compared to the superficiality of the situation. She tried to smile, but the smile broke before it reached her eyes. With every passing minute, Cassandra felt more isolated at that table. While Itan discussed investments with Marco and exchanged inside jokes with the others, she simply listened. The dinner that was supposed to celebrate love became a stage for displaying power and influence. The atmosphere, which once held romantic memories, now felt cold, distant, almost hostile. Cassandra stared at the wineglass in her hands, trying to find solace in the memory of their first time together. But the contrast was stark. It was as if time had erased the promises of a year ago, replacing them with a reality in which she was nothing more than a supporting character in Itan's vanity show. What hurt her most wasn't the lack of romance, but his indifference. At no point did Itan realize that Cassandra was silent, that her eyes demanded attention, that her presence cried out for recognition. For him, that night was just another opportunity to bolster his image among his friends. For her, it was confirmation that the love she harbored might be one-sided. She held a secret that could touch any heart willing to receive it, but faced with that scenario, she questioned whether it was worth revealing. The disappointment weighed more heavily than the dress on her body, more than the perfume she wore to mark the evening. Cassandra knew something had shifted within her. The night that was supposed to be a celebration had become a turning point. She felt heartbroken, but also a strange clarity. Perhaps this was the moment she finally saw Itan for who he truly was. Not the man with the charming smile in the Seattle rain, but someone who used her as an accessory in his social life, unable to recognize the silent value she carried. And while her friends toasted to business deals and futile conquests, Cassandra silently toasted a bitter discovery. The love she had so cultivated no longer flourished in the same soil. The disappointment, though painful, began to make way for something new. The awareness that she deserved no less than the respect and appreciation she had always given. With every minute spent in that restaurant, Itan's behavior became a cruel mirror of who he truly was. He spoke loudly, gesticulated wildly, and insisted on telling stories in which he was always the hero, the victor, the center of attention. Meanwhile, Cassandra remained nearly invisible, reduced to the role of spectator. She tried to strike up a conversation occasionally, but he quickly diverted his gaze to another topic, always related to business or personal achievements. It was as if she weren't there, as if her presence were merely an unimportant detail. Her heart ached, not only from his indifference, but from the painful contrast between the man who had once held her hand in silence and the man who now seemed to feed off the applause of others. He not only ignored her, at times he displayed a selfishness that hurt even more. Instead of valuing her in front of his friends, he treated Cassandra as a footnote in his life. When someone asked how they met, Itan told the story quickly, almost banally, without emotion, as if it were just another irrelevant episode. Cassandra felt her stomach churn. For her, that day in the Seattle rain had been a milestone, the beginning of a dream. For him, it seemed like a weightless coincidence. This difference in perception began to further erode her certainties, leaving her with the feeling that perhaps she had over-idealized a man who never lived up to the image she had painted. His selfishness was evident even in the details. While everyone toasted, Itan forgot to include her in the collective gesture, raising his glass without even meeting her eyes. When the dishes arrived, he talked business, while Cassandra ate in silence, her heart growing heavy. No compliments, no comments about the special day, not a single word that showed he remembered her efforts. It was as if the evening had been organized solely to satisfy his vanity, leaving her aside like a voiceless extra. With every passing minute, Cassandra felt the weight of loneliness grow, even though she was sitting next to the man who claimed to love her. What hurt her most was realizing that Itan no longer made any effort to hide his indifference. There was no disguise, no care taken to maintain the illusion. He was so immersed in his own importance that he didn't notice Cassandra's teary eyes, nor the way she tried to force a smile. For him, it was a night of social conquests. For her, it was the silent destruction of a dream. Deep down, Cassandra was beginning to understand that Itan's behavior wasn't just the result of a bad night, but a pattern that repeated itself in small doses throughout their relationship. The anniversary dinner, which was supposed to be a celebration, only revealed what she refused to see. His selfishness was greater than any promise of love. As her friends talked and laughed, Cassandra watched Itan as if seeing him for the first time. The same smile that had once enchanted her now seemed fraught with arrogance. The same tone of voice that had sounded protective now sounded commanding. With each detail, the enchantment of the past faded, giving way to a painful clarity. The man she loved stood before her, but he wasn't who she thought he was. He wasn't the supportive companion, but the narcissist who needed an audience to feel alive. And, realizing this, Cassandra felt a new strength blossom within her, a silent conviction that she could no longer ignore the signs. Itan's behavior was more than a passing disappointment. It was a reflection of the true face he had always tried to hide. As Cassandra remained silent, Itan seemed completely oblivious to her presence. Between sips of wine and forced laughter, she began chatting with Marco, one of her closest friends. At first it was just banal comments, but soon they both switched to Spanish. To Cassandra, the sound was like a call, the language she had been secretly studying for months. Feigning distraction, she lowered her eyes to her plate and let her ears catch every word. What should have been a simple conversation between friends turned out to be a session of disguised insults, laced with contempt for her. Her heart raced, but her face remained impassive. Itan believed he was protected by his language. He laughed sarcastically as he told Marco that Cassandra didn't have the shine he deserved, comparing her to a faded shadow among prominent figures. He also said that she didn't fit into his world, that she was beautiful from afar but dull up close. The words, laden with venom, pierced Cassandra like invisible knives. Each syllable uttered was a blow to her self-esteem, and yet she let nothing show. She simply took a deep breath and listened like someone silently gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to unleash the truth. Marco, embarrassed, tried to change the subject, but Itan continued. Now he was talking about the future, or rather about her absence from it. He confessed to his friend that he was thinking of ending their relationship soon, that Cassandra had served a period in his life but didn't fit into his plans for advancement. He mocked her efforts, saying that she always settled for less and that she didn't have the sophistication to keep up with him. Cassandra, inside, felt her world crumble. The dinner, the dress, the Spaniard's secret, everything seemed ridiculous in the face of this cruel revelation. But paradoxically, something was also growing inside her. The certainty that it wasn't she who didn't deserve Itan, but he who never lived up to her love. The Spanish phrases sounded too clear to Cassandra, who now silently thanked her for every late night she had spent studying alone. It wasn't just a language she had mastered, it was the key that gave her access to the truth hidden behind Itan's charming smile. He believed he spoke protected, untouchable, but in reality, he had opened the doors of his arrogant and disrespectful soul to her. Cassandra understood every word, every insult, every cold plan to push her away, and this knowledge transformed her. The secret she had prepared as a gift of love now became a silent weapon, hidden in her chest, ready to be revealed at the precise moment. She remained calm. She smiled discreetly when someone offered another toast, pretending not to understand. But inside she felt a storm of emotions. Anger, sadness, indignation, shame. All of them mingled in an almost unbearable whirlwind. However, instead of exploding, Cassandra decided to wait. That night, which had begun as a celebration, was transforming into an invisible tribunal in which Itan condemned himself with his own words. And as he spoke, each insult became fuel for her inner strength. Cassandra was no longer the insecure young woman from the beginning of their relationship. At that table, she discovered the power of her own resilience and decided she would no longer be a spectator to her own pain. Cassandra felt her blood run cold with every word Itan uttered in Spanish. The language she had learned with such effort, initially as a gesture of love, now revealed cruel truths to her. It was as if all the time spent, every late night of study, had been guided by a greater purpose, to open her eyes to the man's true face. As she fully understood the insults, her soul shattered silently. He not only mocked her appearance, but also belittled her family, saying he would never mix with people without ambition. These words echoed in her mind, provoking a pain that seemed greater than any physical wound. But even as she felt the open wound, a strange clarity also grew. Perhaps she would finally see who Itan truly was. The revelation wasn't just about the relationship, but about how much she had sacrificed herself to sustain something that, deep down, was never reciprocal. She remembered the times she'd choked back tears to avoid conflict, the moments she'd put his desires above her own, the nights she'd strived to be perfect while he barely noticed her efforts. Now it all made sense. The arrogance that had previously gone unnoticed was revealed nakedly, without masks, without apologies. It was the cruel portrait of a manipulative man who used his charm to hide his indifference. The shock was intense but, curiously, liberating. Knowing the truth, however painful, was the first step to freeing herself from the illusion. The moment she heard Itan confess that he planned to end their relationship soon, Cassandra felt as if the ground had fallen out from under her. It wasn't just the emotional betrayal, but the cold, almost calculated way he laid out his plans. It was as if she were merely a disposable step on his upward trajectory. Inside, a mixture of anger and sadness stirred, but on the outside she remained impassive. This self-control wasn't weakness, but strength. While Itan believed himself safe in his bubble of arrogance, Cassandra was already planning her reaction. The painful revelation shattered her, but it also gave her a powerful weapon: knowledge. He had condemned himself with his own words, and she was the only witness. Amidst the whirlwind of emotions, Cassandra realized something even deeper. It wasn't just Itan who had failed her, but she herself had allowed herself to be diminished so many times without reacting. This realization hurt, but it also strengthened her. The lesson was cruel but necessary. Love cannot survive where there is no respect. With each sentence she translated in her mind, with each insult she deciphered, Cassandra felt the transformation taking place. The passionate and insecure young woman dissolved, giving way to a woman aware of her worth. If before she saw herself as a shadow, now she began to recognize her own light, even if it emerged amidst the darkness. Staring at the cup before her, Cassandra let one last silent tear fall, not out of weakness but as a ritual farewell to the illusion. What she had heard that night could no longer be forgotten. The wound was deep, but it was also the scar that would mark her liberation. There was no going back, no rebuilding something built on contempt and lies. The shock of that painful revelation would be the engine of her turnaround, the beginning of the sweet revenge Itan would never see coming. The truth, painful and relentless, had ripped the veil from her eyes. And in that moment Cassandra understood. The love she had felt for him would not die. It was transformed into strength, clarity, and an unshakable determination to never again accept less than she deserved. GPT screenwriter chat. Within herself, Cassandra felt a flame she had never experienced before. It was as if all the pain, every cruel word she had heard that night, had been transformed into fuel for something new, her inner strength. It was not an easy process. Her heart still throbbed with the weight of disappointment, and her soul carried the open wound of Itan's revelations. But along with the pain came a powerful clarity. She realized that despite being diminished, humiliated, and ignored, she still had something Itan could never control: her dignity. And it was precisely from this that she would rebuild her story. Cassandra decided she would not react with outbursts or scandals. Her revenge would be silent, strategic, revealing her true strength not through shouting, but through self-control. As Itan laughed carefree alongside his friends, Cassandra watched him silently, no longer with passionate eyes, but with the serenity of someone who had already seen the truth. He believed he was in control, but he didn't realize that from that moment on, the power had shifted. Every insult he uttered in Spanish, every dismissive phrase, had become ammunition for her. Cassandra knew that the worst punishment for someone like Itan wasn't an immediate confrontation, but rather the unexpected revelation that she was no longer dealing with the submissive woman she once was. It was only a matter of time before he felt the impact of the strength she now cultivated. In the following days, this strength would manifest itself in subtle but relentless gestures. Cassandra wouldn't cry in front of him, wouldn't beg for explanations, wouldn't be reduced to searching for justifications. Instead, it would be in the calculated silence, the firm answers, and the confident gazes that he would begin to notice the change. Itan was accustomed to seeing her as a shadow, as someone who molded himself to his will. Seeing Cassandra standing tall, self-aware, would be his first shock. With each word in Spanish she would blurt out at the right time, he would feel the ice of fear run down his spine, because deep down you would realize that all the venom you poured out believing you were protected was now stored against him. Cassandra's inner strength wasn't just revenge, it was also the rediscovery of herself. She understood she couldn't change the past, but she could decide what to do with the pain she carried, and she chose to transform it into a foundation, a weapon, a wall. She was no longer the insecure young woman who felt inferior to Ethan's world. Now she was a woman who had overcome humiliation and discovered her true greatness. Ethan might have social power, wealth, and arrogance, but she would never have the courage Cassandra had found in her own soul. This awareness freed her, strengthened her, made her unshakable in the face of the manipulations that once imprisoned her. That night, as she left the restaurant, Cassandra no longer carried only pain. She also carried the certainty that her story would not end there. What Ethan had tried to destroy had in fact awakened something indestructible within her. Revenge would come, but not just to hurt him. It would come as an affirmation of life, of worth, of dignity. Because in the end, the greatest victory would not be exposing Ethan, but rather showing herself that she was capable of rising from the ashes with even greater strength. The moral of her journey was clear. Love can blind, but pain can awaken. And that night, Cassandra awakened. Moral of the story: never underestimate the power of someone who suffers in silence. Pain can be the trigger for the most powerful transformation. Cassandra discovered that her greatest weapon was not revenge itself, but the strength to recognize her own worth and not accept less than she deserved. If you also believe that all pain can be transformed into strength, subscribe to the channel, like it, and tell us what you thought of this story in the comments. Your opinion is very important.